Unprecedented numbers of people have been forced to flee their homes this year, putting pressure on host countries. But new data suggests the majority of migrants make major contributions to their new homes. So is the rhetoric around migration obscuring the benefits? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Folly Thibault. 2015 has been a difficult year to be a migrant. The UN says war in Syria and elsewhere will have forced more than 60 million people from their homes by the end of the year. The unprecedented movement of people is putting huge pressures on host nations in the Middle East, Europe and elsewhere. It's also creating an increasingly toxic debate around the migration issue. One critics say is based more on rhetoric than reality, with a heavy focus on the perceived threats migrants pose to security and the burdens they put on social services. Well, a new report released by the International Labour Organization aims to set the record straight by revealing the contributions migrants make to the societies they join. The ILO says there are more than 200 million migrants around the world of working age. Most live in high-income countries concentrated in Europe and North America. 3/4 of them have a job. That's a higher participation rate than non-migrants at about 64%. So lots to discuss today. Let's bring in our guests for this edition of Inside Story. In London, Jonathan Portes, who's Principal Research Fellow at the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. In Geneva, Michelle Leighton, Chief of the Migration Branch at the International Labour Organization. And also in London, Alan Mendoza, Founder and Director of the Henry Jackson Society. Thank you all. Welcome to Inside Story. Michelle, if I may begin with you, there's no denying that the refugee crisis has soured the debate over migration this year. When you look at the current global political and economic context, would you say that migrants are a burden or a benefit in the current situation?
Well, thank you very much, Foley. That's a very important question. And the data is really difficult in many areas to come by precisely on the contribution of migrants to economic development. But studies do show that, in fact, migrants contribute more, by and large, to the fiscal areas of the government, including by paying more taxes and into the social contribution funds, than they take. So these studies generally show, in fact, that there is not as much of an impact as some may say. Our study that was just released shows that 3/4 of those of working age, as you pointed out, are migrant workers. Mm-hmm. So this also may provide some further information, we feel, to contribute to better data and sound discussion about the impact that migrant workers are having and the contribution they make to economic development.
Jonathan Portes in London, you know, it wasn't unusual this year to hear people, including politicians, talking about migrants, referring to them as a swarm of migrants, talking about Islamization in Europe caused by migrants and so on. There is a sense today that people view migrants in a particularly negative today, more so than in previous decades and previous centuries perhaps. Is this the case, or has it always been the case that migrants are viewed in a negative light?
As you've alluded to, there are always ups and downs in these things. And Jews who came to the UK at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, for example, were often viewed very negatively. People who came to the UK in the 1960s and 70s too. Over time, we now look back and think, well, actually, most of those people have integrated well into UK society and have contributed to both politically, economically, culturally, and socially. So these things do provoke at the time a substantial reaction, but over time, equally, society learns to cope. Mm-hmm. And I would certainly agree with Michelle that overall the evidence is pretty clear that migration has its pluses and minuses, but mostly pluses. On the whole, migrants to Europe make a positive contribution. Certainly migrants to the UK make a positive contribution both economically and fiscally, and perhaps more broadly as well. And I think over time that will come to be realized by most people. There is a particularly negative political climate around in Europe at the moment, partly a consequence of the migration crisis, partly a consequence of much more general feelings of insecurity, which have little or nothing to do with immigration. And it's important to remember that migrants are always a sort of convenient scapegoat for other things that go wrong. But I think we can be hopeful that this too will pass in time.
Alan Mendoza, in the UK, as Jonathan has said, there's a big debate right now on this issue, whether migrants are beneficial or not. What is your view when you look at the current political context and the issue of refugees and so on, radical Islam and extremism? What is your view? Are migrants beneficial or a burden today when you look at the UK?
Well, I think we have to divide this question into several subsections. I mean, the first case, we've been looking at an economic report, essentially. And economically, it's quite clear that migrants have played an important role in Western Europe, in other developed countries, in having augmented local shortages of labour, and in some cases bring in different skill sets as well to do so. So on an economic level, it's quite clear that there is benefit to migration. But, and here's the but, on the social level, there may be problems. And that is alluded to by your description, for example, of extremism. It's known, and we've seen with tragic consequences in recent months, what's happened when, if you like, social cohesion breaks down within European countries and immigrant communities don't get engaged properly with their host country. And as a result, that causes friction, and in some cases, worse than friction, it causes violence. Now, that side of things is going to be very different going forwards, I think, than it has been in the past, because of the absolute numbers we're talking about here. The previous waves of immigration that Jonathan alluded to is quite correct. There were, at the time, people were very concerned about how integration would occur, but the numbers were small in absolute terms. Now we're seeing much larger numbers coming in, and even if people are working, there's a question about whether they're integrating, and that's the big question. Can we integrate larger numbers? And that's why politicians are right to raise the issue of, can Europe, for example, cope with wave after wave of immigration?
Michelle, let me ask you about the numbers that Alan is referring to. Are the numbers larger today than they were in previous decades? And also, when you talk about migration, people often think that, these migrants are coming from poorer countries into rich countries and so on. Is that really the case? Are those the factors driving migration?
Well, there's a number of dynamics at play, as you can imagine, and certainly with the migration crisis, there's much more rapidity and speed of movements that are entering Europe. That's clear by what we know. Overall, in the last few decades, migration itself remains at about 3% of global population. What's changed really is the dynamic corridors in which migrants are moving to find jobs. The migrants from Asia, for example, moving to Arab states has increased 10 times in the last decades or so. So this is really a change in terms of pressure on markets or in terms of the way that migrants are recruited. I would say, though, that the point that Alan made about integration is key. There's going to have to be much better job especially among European countries, to integrate migrants, but that will play into these social perceptions. And right now we have quite a lot of misperception. So if we can get integration right, we can go a long way to ensuring a much more harmonious circumstance. One way to do that is by assuring better skills and jobs matches to migrants and refugees, and that means bringing in business to the dialogue. We also think at the ILO that labor ministries really need to be part of this dialogue along with trade unions. When you bring all of those actors together, those actors of the world of work, you can really begin to look at constructive dialogue that we hope would change the public perception.
Jonathan Portes, before we talk about what can be done to change the perception, because there is a problem there, obviously, I think you all agree with that. On the contributions that migrants bring, just give us a few examples, because very often people will say that migrants are here to steal the locals' jobs and so on. Is that really the case? Is that reality? And talk to us about some of the contributions that these migrants make.
Well, it's not really reality, certainly not in the UK, where there have been quite a few studies which show that actually there doesn't seem to be any significant evidence that migrants displace native workers from jobs. Migrants certainly add to labour supply. They do take jobs, but they also add to labour demand because they spend money, they're consumers too, and overall those effects balance out pretty much. So there's not much evidence of that. In terms of the contribution that migrants make, I think it is pretty obvious to anybody who looks at London, for example, where almost 2 in 5 of the population were born abroad, so migrated here at some point, that most of London's successful industries will not be anything like as successful as they are without migration. So that applies, for example, to the higher education and research sector, of which I'm a part, to the financial sector, but also to other sectors such as accountancy and business services. Those sectors simply wouldn't function the way they do without migration. But I think the integration point is key. Part of it, I think, is to some extent just time and the natural social processes. There was a huge amount of outcry in the 1970s in the UK when a large number of people arrived from East Africa, people of Indian ethnic origin mostly. They were seen as people who were coming to steal our jobs, take our houses, with no connection to the UK, that didn't seem to fit in at all. Some of those people are now, of course, among the UK's most successful business people.
Sure.
That's mostly simply a matter of time and the fact that actually those people wanted to integrate and British society was prepared to integrate them. And I think, as Michelle said, with goodwill on all sides and constructive policy from government, business, and so on, even with these, it's true that the numbers are significantly larger, but they're still not overwhelming. And as I said, London shows that it can be done.
Okay, Alan, Jonathan says integration takes time. What do you respond to that?
Well, it does take time, and it does require goodwill, but the problem is that among some immigrant communities we have people who don't have goodwill, and we've of course seen that in the form of radicalisation, extremism, and in some cases terrorism. So there is a fine line to be balanced between obviously playing a very important role in bringing communities together, making sure that those who arrive are well catered for, not even initially, but down the line as well, 5-10 years down the line, and that does take time, but at the same time making it quite clear that extremism and radicalisation will not be tolerated in our societies. It's not part of our tradition. It shouldn't be part of anyone's tradition for that matter, and that once you come to this country, you accept that actually you want to be part of this country, its way of life, or indeed other countries you come to, and that you want to play a full part in this nation's life as opposed to taking on ideas which are antithetical to it. And I think if we don't get that right, it doesn't matter how much economic success migrants bring. If they bring social discord, which will then lead into violence, reaction and counter-reaction, you will end up with a disharmony within the nation. And that in itself is a recipe for disaster.
So Michelle, then, he makes an interesting point, Alan, by saying that you can talk about all the positive contributions that migrants make and so on, but when you have these issues of extremism and so on, it's very hard to highlight these contributions. So how do you go about dealing with that? How's the IOL deal with this particular issue of extremism?
Well, it certainly is an issue of concern, and the tragedies that happened in Paris are of high concern to everyone around the world, because the very reason that you state, there is a growing misperception about what migrants bring and how they can contribute. Hopefully there will be a rebalancing of those attitudes, but that will take leadership, and it will also take, I think, working together. Europe has had its share of fragmentation in terms of the way it's handled the crisis. To be certain, it's complex. Governments have various agendas and they have different needs. But I think there seems to be more of a will to come together, to be more harmonious and consistent in the way migration is handled, and that can only be a positive thing. Two, bringing in society to a real constructive discussion is something that has to happen, and that's why the ILO is encouraging social dialogue about all of the benefits that migrants bring or where they can contribute most, to look at really where real labor market needs are and to look at the economic aspects, not just the social aspects.
Is there a model, Jonathan, that's been adopted that's proved effective? Different countries, of course, have different models when it comes to dealing with migrations. Australia, for instance, is very particular about the people they let in and, want to bring in high-skilled workers and so on. Do you find that there are models that are more effective than others when it comes to migration?
No model is perfect, and every country has its own particular circumstances. On the whole, UK, with some exceptions, has done fairly well in integrating immigrants into both labour markets and societies. But there are exceptions here. Too. Other countries, France has in some respects again done well, but as we've been seeing for some time, there is still some fairly chronic, pervasive racism and discrimination in the French labour market, which in turn feeds through to disaffection among some sections of society. I mean, I think Alan makes some good points, but I do think it's also important to distinguish between integration questions and questions of security, extremism, and radicalization. There is obviously a significant security problem that we saw as we saw in the recent horrible events in Paris among a very small minority of very disaffected people. That is slightly separate from the question of some communities which are not as integrated as we would like them to be. There may be quite large numbers of people in some communities who are not as integrated as we would like, and that is a serious problem. It's not necessarily a problem that leads in itself to extremism or terrorism. For example, there is one of the least integrated communities in London is the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community in Stamford Hill in North London. There's no security issue there. We may or may not think that is a problem of integration and social cohesion, but it's got very little to do with terrorism.
Okay, so Alan, then, on that issue of really distinguishing security and assimilation and integration, how do you respond to what Jonathan just said there?
Well, unfortunately, they're connected. So I'm going to take the opposite view to Jonathan. He's right. Of course, there are communities that are not integrated, but members of many of those communities are not going around shooting or bombing sites in the countries they live in. That's a difference. What we have at the moment is a particular problem with radical Islam, which is represented, it's a small minority, I absolutely agree with him on that, a small minority, but the problem is because the numbers, for example, of Muslim immigrants are so much greater than other groups, even a small minority becomes a larger number than a small minority of any other group coming in. That's where the problem lies. Now, the integrationist issue, you have to look at, for example, Molenbeek, the suburb of Brussels, which has now had a number of confirmed jihadist links. That's clearly a failure of integration by the Belgians, because if you have a whole, if you like, a ghettoised area within your capital city, that is going to be a recruiting ground for terror. But the two go together. The security aspect cannot be unlinked from integration, because if you had better integration, for one thing, you would have members of communities living in those areas informing on things that they suspect are security problems. I think what we've seen on the continent in particular have been, in France and Belgium, members of those communities deciding they don't want to or feel unable to cooperate with the police for various reasons, and that needs to change.
Jonathan Portes.
I mean, I think there is something to that. Clearly, the questions are related, but equally, I think we do have to distinguish between what I would call hard questions of security and the wider questions of integration, which require a much broader social approach. I mean, and again, it's not that we haven't been here before in the UK. When I was growing up in London, in North London, there was a very large Irish community, and there was also, of course, a significant problem with Republican terrorism among a very, very small minority of members of the Irish community and people from from Northern Ireland. Now, those issues were in some ways related, but we certainly didn't say that we should approach the whole question of Irish immigration to the UK, which has a long and generally positive history, through the lens of Republican terrorism. Fortunately, both of those problems have now largely been resolved, both in terms of the integration of the Irish community here and the bringing of peace to Northern Ireland. One would hope that over time the same would be true for Islamic extremism on the one hand and Muslim integration in the UK on the other.
Okay, let's try and explore other things here. Michelle, I want to come back to you, and we mentioned some of the contributions made by migrants, and so on. But that seems to be lost, in all the discussions that we're having today about migration. How do you change this conversation about migration and highlight the positives. And also, if you could tell us about a country, we talked about assimilation and integration. Is there a country that succeeded better than others in this integration, in integrating migrants? I mean, a lot of people often mention Canada, of course, and so on. Is that the case? I mean, is there a country that's doing much better than others when it comes to integrating migrants?
Well, integration certainly is the key point here. And to go back to what Jonathan and Alan were talking about, I mean, successful integration really means at the heart, in some cases, to help find migrants and refugees decent work. And the search for decent work opportunities is a major reason why people move, but even refugees, once they settle and are secure in a place, are looking for jobs. The lack of integration, the lack of finding decent work may actually help foment some of the problems that the commentators were just raising, and these become very intractable and very complex to deal with. There are countries that have sought to integrate, and this has changed over years, and some lessons and model practices that have been documented. But by and large, there is a real need right now to focus on education, helping migrants and refugees with language, helping them find the right jobs that match their skills, helping them understand the culture, and also helping sensitize society. There's a number of good policies that are being undertaken, including in different parts of Europe, that we documented in a recent EU study.
Okay. Jonathan, same question to you. How do you change the conversation today about migration?
Well, I agree entirely with what Michelle just said, but I do think it's also important to separate out these various different issues. So at the moment in the UK, the question of intra-European migration, free movement of workers within the European Union, is very high up the agenda. And there are some economic issues that we need to talk about there, and to explain why, on the whole, free movement is generally beneficial to European economies, including the UK. Separately, as Michelle said, in terms of refugees, we need both to recognise what our international political and moral obligations are, and to ensure that we have effective policies for integrating refugees who do come here. And I agree entirely with what Michelle said. The key is integration within the labour market. And then thirdly, there's the broader question of economic migration, where at least us economists continue simply have to calmly restating the case that while there are pros and cons to economic migration, on the whole, like trade and like other ways in which market economies function, this is something that on the whole benefits our societies and economies as a whole, and that we need to manage it in the best of interests of our countries.
Okay, Alan Mendoza, I think you'll have the last word. So how do you see this issue now evolving, and also how do we change the conversation, and how do governments handle the issue of migration today in the current global context that we mentioned, radicalization and so on? What should be what would be the effective policies, if you will?
Well, I think, as with all similar questions, the way governments will have to handle this is to simply tell the truth. And by telling the truth, that will mean explaining to populations that economic migration is generally a good thing. It does create opportunity, it creates a burgeoning demand, it creates also increases in national output, and all similar things that most citizens will want. But you're going to have to also take the negative side as well and be honest about that. Not allow it to subsume the positive, but to give it a fair point. I mean, right at the start, Michelle labelled it a misperception. It's not a misperception if you have social cohesion being damaged by migration. People feel it, people see it. And to pretend it's a misperception is what will give migration a bad name. If you can confront issues honestly, openly, look at the positives, but also highlight the negatives and how we can change that, then we will be on a better position on migration. I just come back to this point on economic integration. Yes, it's very important to bring, of course, migrants in. In fact, one would assume the reason they're coming is to take jobs that exist rather than arriving and applying for jobs in that sense. But at the same time, it's notable, for example, in the case of the San Bernardino shooter, he was very integrated economically. That didn't stop the social problems around and the radicalisation from taking over. If we don't resolve those social questions as well, then the migration story will be doomed.
Thank you very much for an interesting discussion. Thank you all. Jonathan Portes, Michelle Leighton and Alan Mendoza. Thank you. And thank you as well for watching. As always, you can leave your comments on the program's page of our website, aljazeera.com, or you can post your views on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Or tweet us at AJ Inside Story. From me, Folly, Thibault, and the whole team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.